Today's speaker, the 12th president of Purdue University and former governor of Indiana, Mitch Daniels. He was elected Indiana's 49th governor in 2004 and re-elected in 2008 with more votes than any governor in the state's history. During his tenure, Indiana went from an $800 million deficit to its first AAA credit rating, led the nation in infrastructure building, and passed sweeping education and healthcare reforms. Among Daniels' first legislative successes was to create the public-private Indiana Economic Development Corporation to replace a failing state bureaucracy in the mission of attracting new jobs. In its first 4 years of existence, the agency broke all previous records for new jobs in the state and was associated with more than $18 billion in new investment. In 2008, Site Selection Magazine and CNBC both named Indiana the most improved state for business in the country. After a series of transformations, which included the biggest tax cut in state's history, the nation's most sweeping deregulation of the telecommunications industry, and a host of other reforms aimed at strengthening the state's economy, Indiana now ranks favorably in every national ranking of business, attractiveness, and job creation. At Purdue, Daniels has prioritized student affordability and reinvestment in the university's strengths. Breaking a 36-year trend, Purdue has held tuition unchanged from 2012 through at least the 2021 academic year. Student borrowing has dropped 33%, while investments in student success and STEM research have undergone unprecedented growth. It's less expensive to attend Purdue University today than it was in 2012. In recognition of his leadership, as both a governor and a university president, Daniels was named among the top 50 world leaders by Fortune magazine in 2015 and was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2019. Prior to becoming governor, Daniels served as chief of staff to Senator Richard Lugar, senior advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and director of the Office of Management and Budget under President George W. Bush. He was also the CEO of Hudson Institute, a major contract research organization. During an 11-year career at Eli Lilly and Company, he held a number of top executive posts, including president of Eli Lilly's North American pharmaceutical operations. He earned his bachelor's degree from Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs and a law degree from Georgetown. He is the author of 3 books and a contributing columnist for the Washington Post. So please, let's welcome Mitch Daniels to the podium today.
Thank you, Allison, for that introduction. It was lengthy. You neglected to mention I'm also a notary public. I am glad to be back for what, astonishingly, when I went back and looked through the calendars, is the 5th time I've had this privilege. Some of you veterans of the club are probably humming my favorite country and western song right now, How Can I Miss You If You Won't Go Away? Coincidentally, 4 of those 5 times coincided with chronological landmarks. I was here in 2001, right after I turned 50. I was here in 2010, right after I turned 60. And recently, I hit the next decennial mark. It didn't really bother me because when I was working for Ronald Reagan, he turned 70, and he said, "What's the big deal? It's 21 Celsius." I got grandchildren now. I told my 7-year-old grandson said, "Grandpa," he said, "how old are you?" And I told him, and he furrowed his brow. He said, "Did you start at 1?" But it's a thrill to be back. I've always had a great time here, and everyone's been very gracious. I remember after one of those speeches, some member, a very lovely lady, a little bit matronly, came rushing up enthusiastically, and she said, oh, I guess it was Governor, thank you for coming. I just really enjoyed everything you had to say. That was just superfluous. And I said, well, thank you, madam. And she said, do you think your remarks will be published? And I laughed and said, oh, if so, only posthumously. She said, I do hope that'll be soon. Which now it could be, I don't know. So thanks for having me back. And as I looked ahead to this particular occasion, it occurred to me that today I get to give more or less the speech that I always hoped I could give here or somewhere. And this is the perfect place and audience to do it. I had always hoped over those last couple decades that there'd come a time when, in gatherings like this, we'd be able to celebrate a state, as we often used to say, of genuine promise and prosperity. And although we've got too many holes in the Swiss cheese and much, much work left to do, there's just so much to celebrate about the Indiana of today. And this is the place to do it, because you are the people who have done it. The epicenter of our growth is Metro Indianapolis, and it's the enterprises who are here and the enterprising men and women who created them and lead them that have made so much opportunity for so many others. And we are a place of essentially zero unemployment, more jobs than people, as we read on a regular job openings than people to fill them, as we read so often. We're a place where the population now is growing, not as fast as we'd like, but faster than any place between Iowa and Maine. A place so much more diverse in its economy, with a thriving, for instance, life sciences and IT community here that was only dimly visible 20 and even 10 years ago. We're the state, year after year now, ranked as having the #1 infrastructure in the country. A state still rated very high for its business, and a state that has taken care of the taxpayers' dollars and remains one of the few AAA credits in this country, as I used to marvel and still do, a state with a credit rating better than the federal government's. So, again, I say all this in salute to you in large part. We said over and over in my last job, we reminded each other, government does not create jobs, never did. Governors, presidents, they don't run economies. It grates on me whenever you read a news story that uses that terminology. No, government at its best creates the conditions whereby men and women of enterprise create jobs and opportunity and wealth for each other. At its worst, it drives those things away or makes them difficult or impossible to do. But you and the organizations you represent have a whole lot to feel good about, and your fellow citizens, on behalf of your fellow citizens, I just want to thank you for it. So I thought that perhaps the way to approach our reflections together today were to talk very briefly, I promise, about how we get here, how do we stay here, what do we do next, and what do we guard against, what's on the worry list. So let me just, as briskly as I can, deal with all that. The answer to the first question, how did we get here, is not overnight, and it wasn't accidental. Permit me just the briefest of walks down memory lane. Allison remembers correctly. In the first act of the first day of the first term of my job of my previous job, I signed an executive order creating the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, a nonprofit corporation that everyone could participate in, support, so we could have some first-class staff, some people who knew business and knew how to find it and knew how to attract it. Later that was codified in the first bill passed in what some historians believe was the most active legislative session, certainly in memory and possibly in the history of our state. But that was number one because it was always job one. We established that the governor, whoever she or he was, would be the chair of that commission to remind that person what comes first. I made a practice, every time we had a cabinet meeting, that person sat directly at my right hand, and that was always the first agenda topic. And the question was, what's going on that might bring more investment and jobs to this state? And if that person needed the transportation department or the secretary of health and services or the environmental officer to do something to make the next investment more likely, we wanted to hear about that first. And many thanks to my successors. They have maintained their discipline and their focus on this fundamental assignment. It's so simple, but so overlooked in other states that I see constantly that where growth happens, particularly for those who are on life's first rung or lower rung, when more opportunity and growth comes for those folks, all the other work of government becomes easier, and all the other problems that we worry about together are alleviated. In that same year, we began our march as a state out of bankruptcy. Later on built reserves, which are still there and have been protected by my successors. Cut taxes, later capped one form of those taxes at some of the lowest levels in America. Again, another great sales tool for the businesses that we hope will continue to come here and join this club when they do. By 2010, I was looking back on things I'd frankly forgotten until I reread that transcript. Not that, if you can imagine this time, I know a lot of people in this audience are from businesses that only came into the state or came into existence more recently. As recently as 15 years ago, in this state, we taxed businesses. We waived the tax on tools of manufacturing, but not on the tools of the information economy, which was already so obviously becoming dominant. So if you bought a new drill press, you didn't pay sales tax. If you bought a spectrometer or a new computer, you did. We left that era behind. We used the tax until then based on three factors. And so if you built things here, if you had property here, and if you hired people here, we taxed you on that. As opposed to, we want to make that tax free. We want you to sell in the world. That's all we will tax you on. We found out that state government was spending well over half of all its procurement dollars on goods and services from outside the state, and pushed that up to 90% ultimately. And finally made changes, including the right-to-work law that circumstances seem to dictate, always looking for that next step forward to make Indiana a welcoming place, a hospitable place, a place of encouragement to those who wanted to grow a business or start and build a business. And again, salute to those who have followed and to the business community across this state, which has supported policies of growth and opportunity. So what's next? Even by the time I changed jobs, now 7 years ago, it was very, very obvious that the next challenge, that the unchecked box, I often used to say, was human resources, people skills, workforce, and so forth. By then, you're never done, but we had come to the top in terms of cost of doing business, infrastructure, tax system, fiscal stability, all these things. The box we couldn't check was the quantity of quality labor, particularly for the evolving economy, and that remains a big challenge. And so our governors and our legislators and others, our business community for certain, have been very focused on this now for years, and it's exactly what they should be doing. This, unfortunately, is the hardest needle to move. So much more difficult than the other challenges that I think we have addressed as a state. What should we do about it? Well, the effort must never end to improve our K-12 education system, but that is not going to fix this problem. It is too slow, too stubborn, too resistant to change, in some cases too reactionary. And so, although there have been improvements, we will be left behind if we wait on the long, long process of today's youngest people becoming adults educated to a level necessary to support the superior enterprises of the country. So what else do we do besides that? Well, I'm sitting with Allison Bell here from WGU Indiana, something that we brought here, and at our university we have now entered this world through Purdue Global. We educate adults. There are 750,000 people in this state who started college and didn't finish. I'm not talking about people who dropped out of high school or people who stopped at a high school diploma. These are people who attempted college and something got in the way. It's an enormous opportunity. It's a much smaller step to take a person, particularly someone who has now built experience in the workforce, to take them on to that credential, which will, the data are very clear, will enable them to earn substantially more money. And this is what WGU does. This is what Purdue Global does. It's an enormous opportunity. And I'm glad that our state is seizing it in a way that not every place is, and urge you to be supportive of that mission as you have an opportunity to be. Something else that is a great asset and resource for us, and I don't say this, I promise you, just because I happen to be employed at one right now. I think this is manifestly obvious to people who aren't. But in this knowledge economy in which we live, in this technologically driven economy, Research One universities are not just sources of great new talent, leadership, and occasionally innovations, but also economic engines, or they can be. And we have 3 of them, not to mention outposts of those, like the one NASA leads here in Indianapolis. And of course, they employ people directly. They spin off all sorts of additional enterprises and secondary investments. And as they originate, and if they are aggressive, as we are certainly trying to be at Purdue, at creating new businesses. We were 3rd in the country again last year in new startup businesses, behind MIT and Stanford, and well ahead of number 4, which was an obscure university in Cambridge, Massachusetts. There's a project which another of Indiana's crown jewel assets, the Lilly Endowment, conceived and launched in regional development around our university. Last year, Tippecanoe County was number 1 in America in the growth of wage gains. I don't know if it's an aberration, I hope not, but in any event, it has to be indicative. And Bloomington is another great source. South Bend can be a greater one than it is now. And so it's been so important. The endowment and others have seen the value of these resources and are trying to encourage more indigenous activity and more collaboration between them. You know, the project I mentioned in the area of around Tippecanoe County is a 10-county endeavor. And when Saab and Schweitzer Electric Engineering Systems and Rolls-Royce and other employers now come and locate on the boundaries of our campus, they can hire people from all those counties. And so in the world we're in now, these are great assets that not every state has to the extent that we do. A third thing we can do is is to change our mentality and become aggressive about gaining brains. When I first ran for office, people said, well, what are you doing this for? I was a no-name first-time candidate. And I used to say, I'm tired of seeing our best young people leave and go somewhere else. Not because they don't love this state, but because they fear that they won't find the economic opportunity here that fits their hopes and dreams. We've come a long, long way from there. We've had a net ingress of college graduates, if you take that as a proxy, a rough proxy, for, over the last 2 or 3 years. Not that many, got to be bigger, but the flow has reversed. And meanwhile, we need to get on offense in a way that we haven't been before. This is a great place, as many of you will have come from somewhere else can testify. It's a great place to do business and to live and certainly to raise a family. And we've got a lot to offer. There's an endeavor going on now. We are certainly supporting it. I know other schools are taking part. Has identified 1 million people out in the world who have a nexus to Indiana. They either grew up here, went to school here, or both. These are people who also have shown some propensity to mobility. They may have moved recently, changed jobs recently, some reason to think they might be interested in coming back or relocating. Last time I checked, more than 200,000 of them have been contacted. 5,000 were involved in active conversations, and there are now multiple success stories of people who have actually been matched with an employer, maybe somebody here, and come home or come back. I look for this to be, if we're aggressive about it, I look to this to be a great, great possibility. And don't overlook the 60,000 prospects who are here now. I'm talking about the students from other places who are on the Purdue campus, the IU campus, and all the other schools here that we're so blessed with in Indiana. They're sitting right here and they're getting an exposure to the advantages of this state if we are clever enough and industrious enough to bring it to their attention. I confess I was too slow to think about this, but starting 2 or 3 years ago now, the first thing our incoming freshmen see on the first day of their freshman orientation period is a video that says, "Welcome to Indiana." Oh, it talks about Purdue, all right, but it shows the rest of Indiana. It shows your businesses. It shows our parks. It shows our recreation, our cultural offerings. It's just an introduction to a place that they're going to spend the next 3 or 4 years and maybe, we hope, much longer. And then, of course, we have we ought not overlook another fantastic asset we have in this respect, and that is Illinois. There's a Facebook site called Leaving Illinois. We have a ton of Illinois students on our campus. Whenever I meet one, I say, "Oh, a refugee, welcome." I say, we have a very generous asylum policy here in Indiana. I shouldn't digress, but I just have to tell you that I've got a million stories about this, but my favorite is I was asked to give a speech on more or less the topic of economic development, state economics, in Chicago a few years ago. And one of the people who preceded me that morning was a big business person, and he got up and apparently gave just almost a commercial about Indiana. Oh, he says, "My gosh, their taxes are fair, their regulation is fair, their litigation climate, their infrastructure," basically gave our speech. He said, "We've been talking to folks over there. They all talk like business people, and they want to help us solve our problems. They looked at it from our side, on and on." He said, "Not only that, the next day the governor of the state called me, and he talked like a business person. Before we hung up, he gave me his personal email and cell number." He says, "Now that's the way you do business." So according to this guy, I met him after, he said, they go to the Q&A period. First person says, "I got a question, but before I get to it, I need to tell you something. Here in Illinois, when they give you the governor's cell number, it means something different." Did not make that up. Okay, so we've come a long way, And we think we know what works. And there are some things we can be doing, all of us together. What to worry about? There's always this list, in business, you've got, if you don't have a worry list, you're not thinking about, you're not looking close enough. So I've got 2 or 3. Complacency would be one. The competition does not stand still. I'll tell you what, states like Ohio and Michigan for sure, Wisconsin, they were great to compete with 10 and 15 years ago. They have changed in many, many ways. They have improved. Go look at these business ratings. Some of them have come up for a long time. Indiana was the only non-Sun Belt state in the top tier of any of those. And now you'll find, here and there, you'll find some of our neighbors. That's a great thing about the federal system. People copy what works and observe the mistakes of others and avoid them. This labor force issue remains, thank goodness for all the work that's being done. It remains an enormously important thing. If we don't solve it, we've had a little bit of slippage, I notice, in some of these ratings. That's almost always what is holding us back. So our leaders are working on the right thing, and we all need to support that. Utility costs and energy has historically been a big plus for this state. And I'd taken my eye off this, I confess, for a while. I don't have an answer for you. I just know this deserves our attention. Just in the last 10 or 15 years, we have gone from, in residential energy costs, from 9th to 15th, in commercial from 3rd to 30th, and from industrial 11th to 29th. Now, residential costs, given the fact that housing and living costs generally are still so very affordable here, 15th is probably not a terrible place to be. But when you're the most manufacturing-intensive state in America, then having industrial costs now worse than the median and commercial costs tracking with them is worth keeping our eye on. And this is a historic advantage we would not like to forfeit. Then finally, and I was expecting to spend much more time on this, and I'm happy that I don't have to because it's become a focus, belatedly, of many of you and of those with public responsibilities, and that's health care costs. And since I assume you've been tracking the latest analyses and information on this, I won't spend a lot of time reciting it, but we have almost tripled the cost per worker or per individual, their costs of health care insurance just in this last 15 or 20 years, now more than $800 per a month. There's a real irony here. We are a free market state. We are a state which has seen and tried to nurture the benefits of competition, and yet in this one sector, we are enormously uncompetitive. There have been 800 mergers of hospitals just in the last 10 or 12 years, and there's some dispute about how much that contributes to these rising costs, but there's no way it's helping. What is clearly a driver, as you've probably been reading, is the concentration of physician practices. Over 70% of the physician practices now are owned and probably more than that controlled by hospital systems. The national average is 44%. Every piece of research I've seen says this is the #1 driver, and this is a menace to our individual families. It's certainly a menace to our business leadership and future prospects. I think it's very isolated, but I had a conversation last year. I heard something I never expected to hear. It was somebody from a business out of state, but not too far out of state. And I said, well, you got to put that next facility in Indiana. He said, no, we have a saying in our ABI. I said, what? Anywhere but Indiana. And it was healthcare costs that were bothering him. So the current initiatives to bring more transparency to what things actually cost and what we were being charged and how that compares, very, very good start. I'll just tell you, at Purdue, we got tired of waiting. This year we have peeled off. We started with orthopedics and imaging, 2 of our higher cost items. We put them out for auction. We are going elsewhere than in the system that had been supplying it. We're going to tell our employees we will put you in a car, I'm not exaggerating, we'll put you in a car, we'll provide you a hotel overnight if that's necessary, and we'll give you a very big check personally. But you're not going to the hospital near here, you're going down to one in Carmel or Mooresville. Next year, we plan to move on into probably into physical therapy and to infusion, and we'll just keep peeling away costs. Let me just tell you that first one on on hips and knees, we're going to save $1 million this year. You want to know how we keep tuition down? That's a small example. So, enough of the storm clouds, enough of the worrying. Let me finish with where I started, with congratulations, and just a couple words of reminder. I don't have to remind this particular audience of the importance of continued innovation, continued improvement, certainly of speed. As we said so often in this world, whether you're a state or just a business enterprise, if you slow down, someone will pass you. If you tread water, you will sink. I say to our public officials, congratulations, but take us further. Don't worry too much about the slings and arrows that any suggestion of change always brings. I used to tell colleagues wherever I was at the time, don't worry about the mud balls and the criticisms. Results are trump. Well, I can't say it quite that way anymore. It confuses people. What I sometimes say, and somebody in the audience reminded me of this, is what a Hoosier farm wife up around Muncie said to me at a somewhat low moment when we were taking a lot of incoming over whatever we were pushing at the time. She said, "Oh, Mitch," she said, don't fret too much about that. Just remember, dogs don't bark at parked cars." And she was right. And so wherever you are, whatever organization you're part of leading, I would just encourage you, never park the car. If you keep it moving, sooner or later, you leave the dogs behind. Thank you very much for having me back.
I do feel like I read your obituary to you sort of at the beginning when I went through all your accomplishments. But going back to your time as governor, you had a lot of stubborn problems to address. Of all the things you accomplished in that 8 years, what do you think was the most stubborn problem that you weren't sure you'd get accomplished, but you did by the time you got out the door?
Yeah, it could have been reform of education, because there's just an awful lot of vested interests deeply rooted there that are reluctant to see any change. So that was one, I think, for a long time. I thought we'll just not get too much done there. But I would switch to something a little less tangible, really. I always felt that the number one challenge we had was to try to spread a mentality of excellence and insistence on breaking out of the pack, which has not been associated with our state historically, but it can be. And so I was hoping that the accumulation of things that we might do, targets we might aim at, would persuade a critical mass of people to never ever settle for middle of the pack here and to be a leadership state. And I do think I see evidence of that happening, and certainly in our business community, and I hope nothing would make me happier than to have that become the profile of our state.
Yeah, great. First card is interesting. As the parent of a recent Purdue grad, thank you for all you have done to keep tuition costs flat. What advice would you give other universities to follow your lead?
I've always been really shy about prescribing that anything we've done at Purdue applied to any other school. Every school is different. Every school has to make its own choices, and so I don't fault anybody for making different decisions. We're a school, though, I think that should prize accessibility. We're a land-grant school. A lot of people, even in Indiana, a lot of people overlook this. You get further away, they think we're a private school, or even here Ivy League, based on the great achievements of our faculty and our graduates. But we at least should never lose sight of the goal of being accessible to any student who can meet our standards. So yes, of course, I do believe that should be part of the responsibility of anybody in this day and age when higher education has become so expensive to do anything they can to keep it down. People worry about student debt. There's 100 ideas about what you ought to do about it. And I keep saying, well, okay, fine, but the first thing you could do is don't charge so darn much in the first place.
A couple of questions on IUPUI, actually. Urban campuses are obviously vital to thriving cities, and when people think about IUPUI, they don't always think about Purdue. And so where do you see the IUPUI in 5 years as it continues to grow?
Well, I love what's happened at IUPUI. Nasser Paydar's here, and he's just a spectacular chancellor. Charles Bance was before him. The growth of that university, I mean, is really a case study in what I was suggesting about the value, even beyond the educational value, that such an institution brings to its community and to maybe its broader surrounding community. Now, that said, you say people don't always think of Purdue. I'm not sure if people ever think of Purdue. By the way, that's what the P in that's for, in case nobody, I don't know what you thought it was, but it actually is Purdue. I'm going to tell you, it's a little bit of a sore point with many of our graduates and alums and others, people in the Purdue family, that we're now, it's been growing. Our two colleges, we just have two colleges there, science and engineering, are more than a third of the undergraduate students. Every year, they are a big majority of the top students. They give an award, I think I'm right, Nasser, to the 100 top students every year. Last year was 54. I think it's been as high as 67 or 70 of those have come from the minority of student body that's at Purdue. Our people represent a disproportionate amount of the research. When they list the 10 degrees at IUPUI that produce the highest incomes, 9 of them come out of the 2 Purdue colleges. So we're proud of the job that's going on there. If you didn't know that was us, it is. And, I'll just say it'd be nice if occasionally they painted, I don't know, a screen door or a trash can or something black and gold.
Okay, we knew this one was going to come, and I have several of them. Can we talk you into putting your name in the hat for 2024?
What hat are you? No,
I don't want the audience to think I'm not listening.
People now and then will say something like that. When they say it up around our campus, I always tell people, at this point in life, I am not taking the demotion.
Okay. Okay, one more politics, and then I'll leave that. Would you personally like to see a viable third party in the United States?
Let's see. I can deal with this one. I've told people for a long time, I feel so fortunate in many, many ways that this job came along. Well, one of them is that I can duck every political question. I can say, well, I might have a view, but it just wouldn't be appropriate. And so I don't talk ever about things that are all partisan. I guess I can say on this that the two-party system should not be lightly abandoned. It has served this country very well. Just go look at the multi-party democracies. You wouldn't want to be Italy, and or most of the European countries. It can lead to paralysis, and if you think we have some division now, just start carving up into even smaller slices. So it's not performing well at the moment, but it's been resilient, and I hope will return. Its resilience has usually come from whatever party wasn't doing well, figuring out maybe we ought to be more inclusive here. Maybe we ought to reach out, try to find the center before we can win again. And I guess I'm still hoping that that will occur. So I'm not rooting for a third party, although there certainly is as scholars have identified, a so-called exhausted middle right now that's uncomfortable with the what it perceives as the somewhat extreme views of the parties as they are led today.
A couple questions on your thoughts on the current national deficit and thoughts on how to start digging out.
Yeah, I think it's to me it might be the single biggest indictment of the two parties we have that neither one of them is talking about this at all, and I believe that it is really. It's not just a fiscal issue. It's not just an economic menace. It's certainly both those things. To me, it's a test of our democracy. We are borrowing unbelievable amounts of money that we're not spending. We're not investing in the future. We're spending it on current consumption, writing checks to ourselves. And this is, to me, an incredible disservice to the young people of this country, and a problem that we're going to deposit on them. And everyone, probably in this audience, with the exception of the very youngest, should feel a little bit guilty about this. And yet, one was able to say until 2 or 3 years ago, if we just get going, we can manage this. It's getting harder to say that. You just go look at the arithmetic. What should be done about it? Pretty simple. Nothing makes any difference if you don't deal with the safety net programs. We have to save the safety net. Anyone who says that this is to suggest reforms in Medicare and Social Security, Medicaid, and so forth doesn't care about low-income people, has it absolutely backwards. If you care about them, you want to make those changes now, because we're not going to be able to take care of them on the current track. And so what do you do? Social Security would be the easiest one to talk about. We should raise the retirement age further, because we're all getting a lot older, living longer, I should say. And this can be done. We should concentrate the money on those who need it most. We should means test it. There's a long story about why we don't, but most of us in this audience could do with either little or less or very little income support from the federal government. And we over-index it for inflation right now. It's absolutely fine to keep up with the cost of living, but that's not what we do. We over-index it. Those are 3 things right there that you could do that would protect those we care about and those for whom the programs are most intended, and meanwhile protect those taxpayers of tomorrow who are otherwise going to be dealt an impossible hand.
Okay, a couple on township government. Will Indiana ever eliminate township government?
Yeah, I think one day, eventually. This was, we had, there's work on the shelf, by the way. This is one we don't have to start over. We don't have to commission any new studies. We don't need any additional commissions. A great bipartisan group led by my predecessor, Joe Kernan, and Randy Shepard, our then Chief Justice, led a group which produced 27 suggestions to modernize our antique system of local government here. 7 of them became law, but some of the biggest ones, including township government, did not. Now we got rid of township trustees, I guess, and that was, this state supposedly, small government, conservative state, we elect more people to office, political offices, than any state in the country. And so yes, I still think at some point someone will pull down the work they did, probably still be evergreen fresh, and pursue those reforms. But good government reforms of that kind, process and so forth, these are not the kind of things political careers are made of. Nobody leads torchlight parades, for cleaning up the machinery of government. But once in a while it needs to be done, and maybe this one I think does have some bipartisan possibilities. So maybe someone will summon the energy to go after it again.
Okay, how do we, couple questions on this topic. What are ways we can make progress on breaking down the economic and racial barriers that exist in our state to get a more equitable system within the state?
Yeah, well, listen, the starting point is lift all boats. You know, in this national economy, and I have no reason to think it looks any different here, people haven't noticed yet, but incomes at the bottom are rising faster than incomes at the top. And we need a long, sustained period of that. That's a starting point. You know, I have to be honest and say that although there are barriers and there are injustices and unfairnesses, I don't think that is at all a total explanation for the continuing inequities that we have. And so there are certainly educational differences. We've started 2 high schools in this town at Purdue. Why? Because if we wait for the current system to turn up enough students, we're desperate to educate to a Purdue standard more low-income students, first-generation students, and minority students. We do everything we can. They're just not there. And so we start to create our own pipeline, and I hope we're well embarked on doing that. It's going to take efforts like that on the education side, I would certainly go back to something I talked about. Go look at who goes to WGU. Go look at who goes to Purdue Global. A majority of our students, these are adults who didn't get there the first time around. A majority of our Purdue Global students are minorities, and a majority are women. And so there are things you can do without waiting for the miracle or the millennium at the K-12 level.
We're getting close to being able to conclude here. You're an avid reader. What's the book in here that everybody should be reading? Yeah.
Well, it'll betray both a friendship and some preferences. But George Will's The Conservative Sensibilities is a remarkable book, even if you don't agree with where he comes out. It's a history treatise and of things that have come out recently. I would certainly cite it. I encourage our students to read history and biography. History, if they want to understand that very few things are coming around for the very first time. Biography, if they, as so many are interested in leadership. I don't know a better way to, I've never found a how-to book that I thought was too valuable. But if you hope to have positions of responsibility in any of our 3 sectors, to me the best reads are about people who have led successfully, what they did well, where they fell short. And so I've devoured a lot of those.
People should also be reading one of your 3 books, right?
No, I wouldn't recommend that. Not when there's so much better out on the market.
Okay, well, we're close to 1:30. I wanted to take just an opportunity to thank you in front of everybody. 8 years ago, we had the Super Bowl, and I had the opportunity to be the CEO of the Super Bowl when you were governor, and you answered my call every time. The cell phone, I called you all the time for direction, advice, and our Super Bowl was a success, but partly because you were so involved and so helpful, so thank you.
Well, everybody knew to take Allison's call back then. And I still do. You know, you must have had the same feeling I did. When I got up on Sunday and it was 57 or 8 degrees, I thought that's only happened one other time. Yeah. And that's because she has a pipeline to the Almighty. Yeah. So you're the one we should thank.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, well, what a great afternoon with Mitch.